So I just wanted to say thank you to everyone for logging in today, and to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on. I'm meeting on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. Pay my respects to elders past and present. And for those of you in different locations, feel free to write your own relevant acknowledgement in the chat. But this is a general kind of skills seminar today. I actually grew out of one of the morning teas, I think last year, where one of our mugs that we drink out of, our eclectic mug collection in the History Common Room, which is also in the Rhys Isaac room, which is someone we'll hear about today, I'm sure. My recollection of it is that one of the students drinking out of the Richard Broome mug with a big picture of Richard Broome on it said, "Who's Richard Broome?" At which point Katie was quite shocked, and we then realized that the sort of value of filling in some of the students about the history of the history department and some of the foundational figures and some of the older history going back to the university's foundation and the way that it's shaped our culture and continues to do so. And I think we do actually have quite a coherence that goes right back to those early days, particularly with a focus on social justice, research and history, and on marginalised histories, and sort of history from below, the things that I thought about. But I'll hand over to Katie, who's going to talk further about this. And thank you so much, Katie, for helping us out. It's very generous of you. So thank you. I'll hand over to Katie.
Thanks, Tim. I was going to say, don't say too much more or you'll steal everything I'm going to say.
Yes, yeah.
But just to continue the story about the impetus for this seminar was not only people didn't know who Richard Broome was, which was pretty shocking, but also there we were in the Rhys Isaac room and I said, so do you know who that picture up there on the wall is of? And people didn't know who that was either. And that was to me almost more shocking than not knowing. Well, anyway, it was shocking not knowing who Rhys was either. So Tim and I thought it would be a good idea to just tell you a little bit about the history of the department. It has had a very distinguished history, and I think it's really valuable for us all to recall that, to know a little bit about it, and to see some of the synergies with the earlier years, and then to think about also the ways that things have changed and how we've coped in times of challenges. So I'm coming also from Wurundjeri country, and it's wonderful to be able to acknowledge the custodianship of this beautiful land and its waters. And of course, Indigenous history is something that will feature a little bit in this talk because it has become one of the defining features of our department. I can assure you, consulted some of the elders of the department in preparing this, so it hasn't all come out of my head. And I've also had a look at a book called Building Trobe University, Reflections on the First 25 Years, which was co-edited by Bill Breen and John Salmond, both from this department. And then the more recent 50th anniversary edition called From the Paddock to the Agora, 50 Years of La Trobe University, in which our very own Claire Wright also has a chapter. So for those of you who don't know anything about the very early history of the university itself, it opened in March 1967. It was one of what we will call the Gumtree or the Bush universities, along with Murdoch in WA, Macquarie in New South Wales, and Flinders in South Australia. So the Oversight Committee was appointed in 1964 by the Victorian government, called the Third University Committee. And it was to decide on the site, on the administrative structure, and to start recruitment of staff. Significantly, I think that committee had on it a highly distinguished historian called Kathleen Fitzpatrick, who was at the University of Melbourne. And it's interesting, I think, to think about what legacy she may have had. Welcome, Richard. I was just saying I have been in consult with some of our elders, you, of course, one of them, and Jim Hamilton and also Diane Kirkby. So the university opened in 1967 with a very clear radical intent to be very different from University of Melbourne and Monash University. We called them the Sandstones then. This was before the idea of the group of 8 came around. It was to cater to students from the northern suburbs, to students of, particularly first in family students. It was also very radical in its conception of how a university might function. So it was actually designed around the residential colleges, and they were to be the hub of university life, where there was thought about 40% of the students would reside. There'd be a kind of ambition to make it a place for the fulfillment of lives. And I'm quoting here from David Myers, who was the founding Vice Chancellor, where students, quote, might develop the personal qualities which they need if they are going to make a useful contribution to the life of the community. So this was to be a university with a social purpose. It was to be a university with a fairly flat structure, where professors rather than administrators were to be those who made the decisions and who, really ran the university. It was also to be designed based on schools rather than disciplines. So there were 5 schools, 4 schools: biological sciences, physical sciences, social sciences, and humanities. So right from the very beginning, social sciences and humanities played a really significant role in La Trobe as a university. And students were to choose from a broad range of subjects that were deliberately interdisciplinary. And in fact, they were interdisciplinarity was effectively mandated through the curriculum that they could choose from. So I've already mentioned that the students were basically to be drawn sort of from the northern suburbs. These were not seen to be the students that would normally find their way to Melbourne University or to Monash. Significantly, La Trobe had a higher portion of women students than the other 2 Victorian universities. And that was compounded, if you like, when Whitlam introduced no fees for higher education. More women, funnily enough, found their way into higher education, and especially at La Trobe, there was an effort to welcome mature age students, and many mature age women took up that opportunity, my mother being one of them. So she began her Bachelor of Arts degree here in the 1970s, part-time, and the conversations at our dinner table changed significantly. She started talking about Marx and Weber and Durkheim, and sharing. She was studying sociology and literature, sharing with us some of the theories of those people. My father was not amused by this, I have to say. So the conversations became quite engaging at times. But her education had a profound impact on my family and on, I think, myself. And actually, we ended up both graduating in the same year from different universities, but the same year, 1985. So I have been meaning to show you all this time my PowerPoint, which it won't surprise you to know that I have. So let me switch it on. Can you see that? Can you see it? I can't see you. So
no, we can't see anything.
No, not yet.
Oh, hang on. Okay, just a minute.
But it came up before, so.
Yes, okay. It's all right. I know what the problem is. I have to share my screen. You can tell I'm out of practice. So I will share this and then I will find my PowerPoint. Can you see it now?
Yep.
Okay, great. So, a little bit about that's a bit about the university. So now I want to talk about the Department of History more broadly, or more specifically, really. So it was also founded along with the university in 1967. The David Myers Building, which would be the home of history from the very beginning, named after, as I said, the first Vice-Chancellor, wasn't finished. So students had their initial tutorials in Glen College. So John Watson, who would go on to be Paul Keating's speechwriter when Paul Keating was Prime Minister, and also has been a prolific author and commentator, social commentator. He was one of the founding students in 1967. He'd come from Gippsland, and he writes about his early years in the book, From Paddock to the Agora. It's real well worth reading his chapter, I think, if you want to get a sense of the flavour of those early years. There was one first-year history offering, History 1A, an examination of selected aspects of world history since 1914, designed, quote, to stimulate historical insight into the contemporary situation. The founding professor of the department was Alan Martin, who was recruited from Adelaide University, and he was an Australianist. He set about recruiting many more staff, and he kind of went at a rate of about 6 a year, it seemed, for many years. Just as an aside, the AHA Award for Early Career Researchers is named after Alan Martin. So in his second year, he appointed John Hurst, John Barrett, Peter Cook, all three of whom would go on to make really significant contributions to Australian history. He also appointed John Salmond, who was in 1970 appointed or promoted to Professor of American History in the department, a position that he held for 33 years. And if you, next time you're in the department, have a look at the photographs of these early professors that Richard Broome put together when he was head of department. They give you a little bit of the biography of the men who led the department, all very male dominated, and some of the significance of their careers, both in terms of intellectual careers, but also more broadly, their leadership within the university. So in the third year of La Trobe, Inga Clendening was appointed, and also the British historian Jim Hamerton, along with others. By the time Richard joined the department in 1976, there were 44 historians on staff. And between them, they included 3 Southeast Asianists, 3 Latin Americanists, 2 Pacific historians, 4 early modernists, 2 Africanists, 3 or 4 Americanists, and also a number of Australianists, and there was religious history and also prehistory being taught. So this was an incredibly diverse department with really significant depth and breadth. The prehistorians would later break away from that department and found the archaeology department. The religious historians covered quite a lot of the ancient history, and then later Adrian Jones would introduce a subject on the Roman Empire. So there was no other department in the country that matched the depth or breadth of La Trobe at this time, and it was understood to be the leading department. But importantly, it wasn't just the scale of or the size of the department that made it so strong and on which its reputation was based. Amongst those very early lecturers was a man called Greg Denning, who some of you will know, whose work some of you may well have read or been influenced by. Greg was actually appointed initially in the sociology department, He had a combined PhD from Harvard in history and anthropology, very, very unusual at the time. He also happened to be a Jesuit priest until 1970 when he left the order. So he started teaching a subject called reflective history, and Rhys Isaac joined the department in 1971, taught that with him for a year before Greg then left to Melbourne University to take up the Max Crawford Chair there. So Don Watson writes about taking this subject taught by the two of them and how significant it was. A little bit of background about Rhys. Rhys had been born in South Africa, migrated to Australia in 1963 to take up a position as a tutor at the University of Melbourne. So he joined La Trobe. When he joined La Trobe, Inga Clendinnen was also there. As I've said, Greg was there. A woman called June Phillips was there, and also another person joined the ranks of this group, Donna Merrick, to make up what became known as the Melbourne School. So they each were working on very different fields of history, but they shared an interest in in anthropological theory in particular, I guess, and they developed an ethnographic approach to history. So they were really interested in the kind of history from below, in studying ordinary people and trying to think about and understand the ways in which those ordinary people understood their worlds. So they were interested in recapturing feelings, in perceptions and experiences. It was a very interdisciplinary approach, very much in the spirit of La Trobe at that time, integrating not just anthropology, but also sociology and archaeology, performance studies. And their interest in ethnographic history brought a particular focus to things like the actions, to rituals, to symbols of a culture, not only its texts. And their work also dealt through nearly all of them with cross-cultural contact, and particularly in settler societies and non-European experience of colonisation. Just to give you a sense of the array of some of their work, this is just some of the books that between them they produced. Really significant contribution to our understanding of a whole array of societies. So Rhys's first book, I've already mentioned Rhys a little bit, but Rhys's first book, as you can see here, is The Transformation of Virginia. And he won the Pulitzer Prize for that in 1983. The first Australian to win the Pulitzer Prize. Geraldine Brooks won it much more recently, but he remains the only historian to have won the Pulitzer Prize. And there's a lovely story about this. Here he is in 1983, and then much later, he was teaching, lecturing in a big lecture theatre when news came through about his winning of this prize, and the Channel 10 helicopter came to interview him. Rhys didn't even know at this point that he had won the prize. So John Sarmond went to the lecture theatre to try and extract him. Rhys kept telling him to go away. John eventually walked into the lecture theatre and announced to Rhys and to the students that he had won this extraordinary award, and that the Channel 10 news team were outside waiting to interview him. The other part of the story is, and I'm not sure whether this is apocryphal or not, but the Vice-Chancellor, when he heard about the helicopters, was very concerned because he was worried that there might be negative press about a convict who had escaped from Pentridge Jail and was rumoured to be somewhere on campus. So to spend a little bit of time talking about the Melbourne group, because they had a huge influence on about two generations really of historians, particularly based in Melbourne. I was lucky enough to be one of those. I studied with Greg at University of Melbourne. Donna Merrick was one of my supervisors. And I then, when I came to La Trobe, I came to know Rhys very well. Rhys used to say that history is a story we tell from the stories we find. He was a marvelous teacher, a passionate contributor, and a wonderful supporter of the postgraduate program and this postgraduate seminar. And so the naming of the Rhys Isaac Room is very much a recognition not only of his standing as a historian, but of the fact that that place where we gather for morning tea, where we used to gather for the seminar, where we conduct both so much of our community life, it's very much a fitting tribute that that room is named after him. Rhys died of a melanoma in 2010 when he was 73, just 2 years after Greg Denning. So those interested within the department in the kind of anthropological theory ran a small-scale societies discussion group, and part of that group were historians from the Pacific, from Africa, from the Americas, and Europeanists. Richard Broome writes and talks about the influence of this group on his own work. And if you don't know the essay by Clifford Geertz called Thick Description Towards an Interpretive Theory of Culture, in Geertz's book called The Interpretation of Culture, I encourage you to read it because you'll gain a taste of the writings of an anthropologist who had a profound influence on this Melbourne school and the tradition, if you like, or a very strong tradition of history within the Melbourne community. But the Melbourne School was just one of the innovations and intellectual strands of history at La Trobe. Another was Aboriginal history. John Hurst, who, as I said, had been appointed, I think, in 1968, he taught the first Aboriginal history subject in Australia in 1972. Richard Broome then inherited it from him, and he began teaching it in 1977. And it has been taught continuously ever since. And I think this is one of the legacies of which we can be justly proud. Richard taught it until 2012, and then it was taken over by Tracy Banham-Newell-Marr, Nadia Rook, Leonie Stevens also taught it, and most recently Jennifer Jones and, of course, Kat Ellinghouse. So that's 54 years of teaching Aboriginal history. It's now a core subject in our major, and we made a commitment a number of years ago that we would always teach Aboriginal history. I think that reflects not just the department's commitment to teaching Indigenous history, but also a broader university commitment to the marginalised, to issues of social justice, and to equity. And I think the role that the university itself has seen itself in playing, seen itself as playing in addressing those issues. That's also been seen through the work of public intellectuals and their commitment to public debate. And in these early years, there was a very, very strong tradition of contribution to public intellectual life, particularly from the politics department, where Judy Brett, Robert Mann, Dennis Altman were all based. John Hurst was history's most prominent public intellectual in those early decades. And of course, some of that work has been continued by our very own Claire Wright and Eve Rees as well. So I've mentioned the high number of women students at La Trobe. There was also a high number of women academics, both in our department and in other sections of La Trobe. It didn't really translate, however, into teaching feminist history, and I don't want to overstate how many women there were. Jim Hamilton actually was one of the first people teaching gender within the department, and his own early work was very much a contribution to a study of gender within 19th century Britain. But the department didn't really start to teach gender in any concerted ways until first Diane Kirkby joined the department in 1988 to take up directorship of women's studies. And Marilyn, sorry, did I say Diane Kirkby? Marilyn Lake joined in 1988 and then Diane Kirkby in 1991. Then I joined the department in 1994. I also, like Marilyn, I also came to teach in the Women's Studies program. And that program was a very strong program, and like the early commitment to interdisciplinary studies, it reflected that very strong tradition at La Trobe. When I came from ANU, I left a department of 12 people and joined a department of about 43, and it was a big change. I gradually moved more fully into history in the 2000s, by which time we had a very healthy and strong group of both gender historians and postgrads. But I found a wonderful photograph here in my cleaning up process of the department. I think it's about 1995. And Richard has helped me fill in the names of those I couldn't remember or didn't know. I'm happy to say that the ones I didn't know were actually what Richard calls faculty guys. You get a sense there of the scale, noting that there's a number of people that are missing. And also it's still very male and very white. So perhaps no surprises there. And but we see Richard over here, faces you might recognise: Richard, Diane Kirkby, Marilyn's not there, and my much younger self down here. So it was male dominated. It was a blokey place, but on the other hand, I have to say that I always found the male professors unanimously very supportive of me and my career. There were a number of male professors who, some of whom had left by this time. Marilyn was the first woman to be appointed as, or to be promoted to professor, and then Diane followed her. So I talked a little bit about the sort of shape of the department, the variety of interests, and some of the research kind of commitments and agendas. It was an early department that was also very focused and committed to teaching, and particularly to innovative teaching. And past department members will recall the very engaged, sometimes quite heated discussions around teaching strategy. There was a lunchtime discussion group that was devoted to discussing different methodologies in teaching. Subject guides were vigorously debated, but also a lot of energy went into thinking about how best to engage students, how things could be done differently. Some of these methods, I have to say, could ask quite a lot from students. There was a 3-hour tutorial, which obviously gave lots of time to discuss and explore for students, but also meant that they had to come much better prepared than most of our current students would. Janet Butler, who was both an undergraduate and then a postgraduate in the department, and whose book Kitty's War later won the New South Wales History Prize, she was telling me the other evening that when she was enrolled in a seminar, an honours seminar with David Potts, who is here, and a man called David Johansson, who was no longer in the department. The whole seminar group was called in for a Saturday before semester started, for a whole day of team building. And I don't know what they did, I have to say, but such kind of expectation of student commitment is just unimaginable now. So another innovation was the postgraduate seminar, which began very early. Richard says it began in 1969. I'm not sure how many postgrads there were in the department then, but it started as on a weekly basis, and was held. When I joined the department, it was being held on Thursday evenings, and I think it had been at that time for a long time. It was held in the common room, now the Rhys Isaac room. Students would bring cheese and biscuits, and someone, I'm not quite sure who, would often provide wine. The format was very similar to our current format. If Bill Breen was there, this was Bill Breen, the Americanist, his standard question, and for one for which students were wise to be prepared, was, well, what is your thesis? It remains, I think, a very pertinent question for you all to think about. Richard has sent me lists of the postgrads enrolled over the many years that he was postgrad coordinator. I counted them. We had 147 PhD and MA students graduated between 1971 and 2003. That's a pretty significant number. And of course, many have graduated since then. So we have a very long and stellar list of graduates from this department. And it's wonderful to have you follow in their tradition. Of course, Thursday evening was not a particularly family-friendly time for either students or staff, and the seminar changed the time to a much more friendly daytime, and then in COVID went online. But effectively, the format and the impetus and thinking behind the seminar has remained the same. But such continuity, I think, masks other major changes that were happening across the university. The innovative college system of the early years was replaced by more conventional faculties and a reduced commitment to interdisciplinarity, with some exceptions such as women's studies and later Aboriginal studies. Schools became departments, and the shift to a university run by administrators rather than academics also had begun. The neoliberal university began to take shape. This was compounded after the 1988 Dawkins Review and reforms, which saw the mergers of colleges of advanced education with universities. This would have a really profound effect on the higher education sector. When the book Building La Trobe was published for the 25th anniversary, John Sarman's introduction, interestingly, anticipates, or he notes the amalgamation that had just happened with what was then Lincoln Institute, which was effectively health sciences, and then which created the Faculty of Health Sciences at La Trobe. And he anticipated the likely amalgamation with Phillip Institute of Technology, which is up Plenty Road in Bundoora, and Swinburne College. And I do think that such predictions suggest why historians should stick to the past rather than the future, because Phillip Institute actually ended up joining with RMIT, and Swinburne became its own university. But John was right to point to a much larger and more diverse university that would be created through the mergers and the changing sort of student needs and demands. But not everything changed. La Trobe's commitment to public engagement was also matched by a commitment to community engagement. That could take many forms, and in the history department, one of the really successful forms that it took, spearheaded by Richard Broome and Adrian Jones, was a very successful series that we called the VCE series, which was creating of small books or booklets designed to provide VCE students with the kinds of material that they would need for their study of the different history subjects that they could take. So it was in collaboration with the History Teachers Association Victoria, the HTAV, and designed around the VCE curriculum. Over the years, we produced 16 of these VC books and sold approximately 100,000 copies. And this is a very own editorial team that was behind this, Richard Broome, Sandra Wilson, and Adrian Jones. Richard's book was the first in the series on refugees, and others followed on various aspects of Australian history, on American history, on Nazi Germany, on other aspects of European history and revolutions. So overall, I would say that the values of intellectual integrity and good teaching were the core values of the department. But in these very early decades, personal integrity was perhaps not so highly regarded. And when I joined, there were many stories of past unethical behaviour, sexual relationships with students, sexual harassment of students. This was not by any means limited to the history department, I should say. There was also very little accountability when it came to research. So staff could go off on sabbatical or outside study program, as we now call it, and not come back not having produced anything. They could go for years without publishing anything, and no one seemed to mind very much. So there were downsides, very much downsides to this sort of much more laissez-faire approach to running a department or a faculty/university at the time. And as you might imagine, that state was not to last. So the first round of voluntary redundancies came, or that I remember, came in the late 1990s, and Rhys was one of those early ones to put up his hand. I think he feared that it might be a situation of last in, first off, and he did not want that to happen. It didn't happen. Another round of redundancies came in the sort of early 2000s. That was then followed by a rush of appointments in 2007 when we appointed something like 4 or 5 people, including Claudia Harker and Tracy Bannerman. So there were fresh winds blowing through the corridor at that point and a real sense of optimism. Other things that were happening at the time is the sort of growth of regional campuses. So it had started with the Bendigo merger of the Bendigo CA in 1994, which was fully integrated by 2004. So in the interim, Charles Fay and Robbie Robinson had joined the history department. Ruth Ford then joined them, and much later, Emma Robinson and Jennifer Jones. A campus was opened at Mildura in 2003 and also at Albury-Wodonga. And Alan Frost, actually, a professor of history, Australian history, was instrumental in the opening of the Mildura campus. And history was integrally involved in offering the core BA up at both Mildura and Albury-Wodonga, while Bendigo were helping deliver it at Shepparton. We only had one teaching staff member on site in Mildura and Albury-Wodonga, so it actually demanded quite a lot from Bundoora staff. And those early days of remote teaching were really quite fraught with problems, which we can talk about if you'd like. Also, this decade of the 2000s saw the first introduction of online teaching. Richard and I developed Australian Environmental History as the first fully online subject to be taught in the faculty. We would now call it asynchronous learning, but we didn't have such a hideous term at that point. The subject itself was extremely successful, but at the time, and it remains so actually, but at the time I think Richard and I were both unprepared and overwhelmed by the amount of work involved. I have to say though, for me, it all seemed worth it when one student commented on their evaluation form that prior to studying the course, they used to see a tree and now they see a story. One of the most beautiful feedbacks I think I've had on teaching. At this point, at some point in that decade, the history department became the history program and we became part of the School of Historical and European Studies with Tim Murray as head of school. Tim was then appointed Dean in 2009. We had a new Vice Chancellor with John Dewar in 2011, or maybe the beginning of 2012. And one of his very first dramatic actions was to effectively tell the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences that we had to undergo significant staff cuts to the tune, I think, of about $12 million, although I'm not quite sure if that figure is right. The upshot of this organisational change impact statement, as it was called, or OSIS for short, was for history to be the loss of 8.5 staff out of 20, or 43% cut, the largest cut of any program in the faculty. As you might imagine, we felt these cuts extremely keenly. There was no transparency about the process, and it was very hard not to feel that history had been singled out for unfair and unfairly targeted. I was head of program at the time, as it was called, and I read back on some of the documents in preparation for this. It's a bit like revisiting repressed trauma. The only saving grace seemed that the week after the redundancies had been announced and all those involved named, that Richard Broome, myself, Charles Fay, Ruth Ford and Andrea Gaynor from UWA won a $600,000 ARC grant to commence environmental history of the Mallee. So of those 5 CIs, 3 of them, Richard, Charles and Ruth, were being made redundant. Richard had chosen, if that's the right word, Richard, to take a voluntary redundancy, but in light of this ARC success, Charles and Ruth, we basically saved their position and they retained their jobs. But the other 6 staff members were not so lucky. The other thing that happened at this time of the OSIS was that the art history department joined, or the remaining members of the art history department, I should say, which I think was by this stage only one, joined the history department. Diane Kirkby had been teaching art history with them for some time. So the trauma of redundancies was revisited in 2014 when the whole university underwent an organisational change impact statement, or an OSIS. Diane Kirkby reluctantly took a departure package, and I'm not sure actually who else we lost at that time. So we were now in a university and a broader higher education sector where the imperatives of national competition, international student recruitment, neoliberal managerialism, and an ever-widening divide between the highly paid VCs, DVCs, and the growing layers of administrators who supported them, and the daily imperatives of teaching and research academics, let alone their students, that divide was widening exponentially. Who and what, we would regularly ask, and continue to do so, is the university for? The 2014 OSIS introduced a 2-college system, and the Humanities and Social Sciences became a school within the College of Arts, Social Sciences and Commerce. Archaeology joined history as a new department. So we kind of come full circle back to where we had started. our teaching offerings became stripped down and streamlined. But the next years actually brought a very different kind of trauma to the department. On the 3rd of February 2016, John Hurst, who had still been very much part of the department, had given a seminar to us just a few months before. John Hurst took his own life. His loss was reverberated throughout the history community. But just 15 days later, Patrick Wolfe, poised to return to the department to take up a short-term fellowship, died of pneumonia, age 66. He'd been a much-loved presence amongst us over various different periods. Patrick had been Tracy Bonavua-Marr's supervisor, and we had just learned also of her cancer diagnosis. And then in October of 2016, Inga also died. Just under a year later, in August 2017, our beloved Tracy died. She was 43 with 2 young children. She already had a stellar career, but had so much more to give. As we had for John and Inga, we had a memorial for Tracy at the Institute of Advanced Studies, which is up in the northern part of the university. And very fittingly, in 2018, the university established the Tracy Bonavua-Marr Fellowship for staff with caring responsibilities. And so we come to much more recent history, and you know too well the shock of COVID and the implications it has had on face-to-face teaching, the further pressures to reduce subjects, and now the new challenge of AI. But I do think, as Tim said at the beginning, that the legacies of this early department are still with us. We may be just a quarter of the size, or you may be just a quarter of the size of the department that I joined in 1994, but the core values of intellectual integrity and good teaching, I think, remain. I'm confident, absolutely confident that they remain. Our staff numbers are now on par with those of Monash and Melbourne universities, but we continue to teach a very different student cohort, and we have lost and retain excellent teaching records with a radically reduced scale of offerings. We've lost our breadth of those early years, but maintain a deep commitment to excellent research and success in research grants. Our commitment to Indigenous history, gender, labour history, environmental history, to the history of the marginalised and social justice, to working in interdisciplinary contexts and across cultures and time periods remains. We continue, I think, to foster strong relationships through community and public engagement. And although our postgrad numbers have declined, as they have across the whole sector, this postgrad seminar and our strong postgraduate community continues. And we continue, as you yourselves are evidence, to attract excellent students to undertake outstanding work. And on that note, I thank you.
Thank you, Katie. That was just a wonderful, rich overview of the whole history of the department. I'm just really glad we recorded it as well, because I just think you did a fantastic job of covering so much in a short period of time, and it's part of our, collective history. Brought back a lot of memories for me as well. So, yeah, thank you. I'll open it up to questions. The tradition is to have questions from the students first to give them a chance to talk.
The long tradition, that one.
Long tradition, which I think is a very good one. So I try and uphold that. So if you can raise your hand, that would be great.
Tim, can I just ask Katie to stop sharing her screen?
Sorry.
Yeah, if you could do that. Yeah, thank you, Katie.
Sorry.
It's all right. I love the pictures that you had. They were great. Where did you find those?
So that funny, the one of the whole staff one had been sitting on my desk for ages, and then in my current process of tidying up my desk, I had put it in a box, and I was saying to Karen yesterday, and I can't find it. Anyway, I managed to find it just before I was leaving the department or my office yesterday. So I was very pleased to locate it again. It's quite a historical snapshot.
Absolutely.
And Richard sent me the fabulous one of him and Sandra and Adrian, the editorial committee of the VCE books.
Yeah. Judy, you have a question?
Oh, yeah, I do. Thanks. I went to Deakin in the early years of Deakin, so I was interested in La Trobe coming, a good decade before that. And you talked about it being the northern suburbs kids being the target, but I thought maybe also regional areas would have been a target for La Trobe as well. And given that we now have these regional campuses, was there a regional component in those early days?
So it's a good question, Judy. And in fact, Don Watson himself was from Gippsland. So yes, and part of the idea of the colleges was that regional students would be able to come and live on campus. So yes, very much. I'm not sure how much kind of publicity there was, about how much promotion of the university there was. I haven't gone into that kind of research, but yes, certainly there were very much a regional component, and a hope that the regional students would join this third university.
Thanks.
I don't know. I mean, I think there would probably been a lot of scholarships available, as Don Watson was on a scholarship, so that it would make it affordable, which a lot of the colleges at Melbourne and Monash would not have been, I think, particularly for regional students.
Other questions from students?
So the requirement was that the Bandura professors would frequently travel to the regions as a part of the teaching over the semester. Is that what you were saying?
So yeah, so when basically Mildura and Albury-Wodonga and Shepparton opened, was when BA began to be taught there, along with other science degrees as well. Yes, so Richard can talk to this as well, but yes, staff used to travel to Bandura. Staff used to travel to Mildura and to Albury-Wodonga. They would fly to Mildura, and usually drive to Albury-Wodonga. And so that was one way in which we delivered the subjects. The other way was lectures would be recorded on videos and then posted up to the departments, and then the staff member there would play the video of the lecture to the students. So there was a time lag, obviously, in that context. It was a pretty, well, I was going to say it was fraught. Richard, do you want to, it was fraught in that there were, it was not in any sense an equitable student experience, I suppose, if I could put it that way.
Oh, hi, Katie. Yes, look, I think you're right there, but the regional campus students did really appreciate people coming for the day or overnight and teaching over 2 days. We flew up to Mildura, we caught the train to Albury-Wodonga, and mostly the Bendigo staff covered Shepparton by driving, 50 or 60K, whatever is each way to do it. And I think there was a genuine appreciation of our coming, but over time, they got the sense that they weren't getting the same deal, and they weren't as Bandura students, and that put more pressure on us to do it. But one thing I wanted to comment on was just the amazing excitement that I felt being part of that department. I just went in 5 days a week because, well, that was expected in those days, but also I just wanted to be there, and many other people did. So the corridors were always full of students. There was no email in those days, so they couldn't email their lecturer. They had to come in and wait, have an appointment. So there was always people in the corridor, a great buzz, people buzzing off to lectures, often with not only their books but a jug and a whole case of cups, because we used to teach at first 3 hour tutorials, and the students liked that. We liked it, but we always had a break for coffee in the middle, and so it was a really bonding thing to do. But the department was just exciting, and we used to have amazing staff meetings too that people mostly all came to, and we would have incredible discussions. People would prepare a discussion paper on the marks, on marking systems and how we marked or how we ran this or that. And so people were really engaged with the methodologies of research through the staff research program, but also just how we processed the department. And we had amazing record sheets. A lot of other departments didn't have record sheets at all. We took them very seriously. And someone about 15 years ago, because they were starting to fill up a whole room, digitized the whole lot. Now, I don't know whether they're accessible or where they are now, but
I've just thrown out a whole lot of mine, Richard.
that was hard copy. Yeah, but someone digitized the whole lot. And there were some amazing records. And the other thing I think that you alluded to, but I'd just like to say, was the mature age students were just the cream of our students. They were mostly women, but not always. People who wanted to be there to study. They knew why they were there. They were not working it out on the ground. They came with this intent. And the way they were selected was that they had to write an essay about why they wanted to come to university. And they also had to do a book review of any book, just so we got a sense of their ability to write and communicate. And tragically, all those personal essays were thrown out by the university in about 2000. They said they shouldn't keep them, they didn't want to keep them. They would have been an amazing record of women's desires for education. And so migrant women who got to come to university for the first time, young women who their parents were opposed to their coming to higher education, but because it was free and because they could get in, they often just asserted themselves to do so. So that was an amazing part of what we did at La Trobe, and they were a joyous students. They were our very best.
Yeah, Richard, I was going to ask about the mature age students as well, because John Salmon told me that La Trobe was the first university to have mature age students in Australia. Do you think, is that correct?
It mightn't be the first, it was very early, but we had this specific program and a way that for people who could come in without having VCE or HSC as was then called. So the essay and the book review was a way of seeing whether people had potential. And then, sorry, I should have said the third thing was we invited everyone in for an interview. So we had, you put your hand up to be on these panels near the end of the year, and you met with the students and talked with them for 15, 20 minutes. And that was just amazing. The stories, the desires that were expressed in those interviews. And that was the final process of a tick. And so it was a very important thing that we did.
And this is a tradition that's been carried on. I mean, I'm just struck by how the mature age students continue to contribute a lot to the postgraduate culture. We've got a big cohort, and I continue to get a lot of applications from mature age students that usually very strong.
Yeah.
And they've had life experience and they've thought about what they want to do, and often they've really wanted to do a PhD for a long time, and they've worked, thought about it, and they're very prepared, and and they contribute a lot. So I think it's a tradition that has carried on, which is great.
And
Richard,
despite
just
having families to look after, they finished off and
Mm.
right on time.
Richard, just your point about the excitement and if you like, the kind of energy of the early large department. One of the things that Jim Hamilton did say to me too is that there were also some quite bitter disputes, you know. So
Oh yeah.
along with the firmly held views and opinions also came that the tensions that were inevitably there.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, there was over 40 people
yeah, that's right.
with often strong views.
Yeah.
Yes, it wasn't paradise.
Just
you
want to
were
make
right.
that point. I think it's really important that people.
You're right to point out about some of the ethical behaviours, but of course that was de rigueur for university culture right across Australia.
Yeah, I know. One of my
and
friends
across
had
business. It was a
yeah,
different world.
yeah.
We think we all look the same or almost the same as people 30 or 40 years ago, but very different thinking about these issues.
Tim.
Yeah, Tim, you have a question. Yeah.
Thanks, Katie. Fascinating seeing how much the program has changed over the years, even the time since I've been here. I'm curious, when you had 40, I remember Peter McPhee saying he spent some time here very early in the department's life, and he said there were 67 or 70 historians in the program. Um, uh, But when the program was at its largest, what were the staff doing? How many courses was everyone teaching, or did they have tiny courses? How did it work when you were with so many
No,
colleagues?
well, the first year courses, I think there was 11, even in around 2000 when I started being program coordinator, about 11 first year courses. And
And
then when I left,
how
we'd
many
be,
students in each course though?
oh, well, first year, maybe 60, 70.
Right.
Because the university was so different, the offerings were much less. Media studies didn't exist, linguistics didn't exist. The archaeology department was part of history, called prehistory. So there were less options. So there were more students because the pie was, the pie was the same or bigger, but there were less departments. So yeah, we had 11 first year subjects. They're all well patronised, and we had, I don't know, probably 20 to 30 upper level subjects. And when I left in 2000, the end of 2012, we'd been pushed to 288, or no, 488. So the 4 at first year and then 8 each at second and third year. So look, the offerings that we had were just amazing. And it just was, there were a lot of students.
And the key difference was that we had a lot more autonomy of what we did.
Oh yeah.
If people
Yeah.
wanted to run a new course, they just did it. And the head of department could hire people like, now this is all centralized and, we just part of a bigger apparatus. Yeah.
Yes.
Well,
I
you
mean,
still had to be able to justify appointments, with a
Yeah.
budgetary,
Yeah.
argument.
and justified the subjects you wanted to teach. It would have to go through
Yeah.
a departmental meeting, but it
Yeah.
was essentially up to history what they wanted to teach.
Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah, we didn't have to, as you've said, Katie. Now we have to spend so much time justifying what we do all the time. that was not so much the case then. Yeah.
Yeah.
Claire's got a question.
Yeah. Claire and
And then
Karen and Judy as well. So yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. I can't figure out how to raise my hand button on my thing at the moment. Maybe AI can teach me that. Katie, thank you for that presentation. You put so much work into it, and I really want to say how much I think we all appreciate that, because you've done a great service to the department. It's something that we can share. I actually was thinking it'd be wonderful if you could share it with the AHA in some kind of way. Maybe we can put a link to this recording, because I think that there is a lot for all of our history there. There's a Latrobe component, but it's wider than that. So I wanted to thank you for that, and I also wanted to thank you for your genuine manifestation of emotion when you were talking about that hard year of 2016-17, where we lost so many of our nearest and dearest, and you were so much a part of that in seeing us all through and holding us all through that period. And that relates in a way to my question. As you know, I found your photocopy of your photo on the photocopier late last night, and texted you to say, is this yours? And the first thing that I noticed when I was looking at that photo late last night in the office was obviously the gender composition, and of course the racial composition of the staff members at that time. And I was comparing it to our photo board now that's up there in the corridor. And we have a very different composition now, particularly gender and sexuality, although we don't necessarily know the sexuality of the people who were in that photo. But it did occur to me that you know, the diversity of the department is in direct contradistinction to the resourcing of the department. So back in those days, you know, as our chat has said, there were 4 full-time office staff and a photocopy person. That's amazing, Richard. And now there's not even somebody to replace the paper in the photocopy room, let alone do any of it. My question is, do you think that feminization of the program has affected the culture of the program in any way? And whether you see that what's happened in history in terms of the increasing representation of women on staff, has that happened across the university, and particularly in other HUS programs as well? So is it a kind of cross the board feminization in the way that we see, you know, the banking sector and other, that well-known sociological phenomenon that when an industry gets feminized, its pay and its resources also tend to go down, it loses value. So that's a little bit of a mucky up question, but I hope you get where I'm going.
Yeah, thanks, Claire. I would just say I was reading something actually that Barry Carr, who was Latin Americanist, wrote as a tribute to Steve Niblo. Steve Niblo was also Latin Americanist, and he took a package in the early 2000s and then died of a heart attack in 2007, I think it was. And Barry mentions in the obituary that La Trobe was one of the most La Trobe history was one of the most linguistically diverse departments in its early years, and linguistically and culturally diverse, which I thought was quite interesting because you can't see that from that photograph. It's not there. So that's just a kind of side comment. And I think probably what happened was also that some of that diversity was lost in the kind of early decades as well, as people moved, you know, onto other positions. But I think that I suppose the feminization of the faculty, it's not just been in history. I think it's been across the board. And you see this in the school now in, you know, who's leading all the departments, and in the you know, the leadership group, senior leadership group within the faculty, that it's predominantly women. Is that, and I guess so your question about whether that is also reflective of the diminishing status of the discipline, the field. I certainly think that there's an argument there to be had. I mean, I suppose I would say it's not just history. It's the humanities more broadly, and humanities more broadly is under attack across the world, or the Western world anyway. And I don't know whether that feminization of the discipline is actually reflected in other places as well. I don't think, certainly that was not the case at Harvard, if Harvard's an example, but I don't know that it's the case in other universities as well in the US or in the UK. So I wonder whether I think it's interesting. I think that there is something distinctive about the way in which the discipline has developed in Australia, where it has actually become much more female dominated than it has in other countries. I don't quite know why that is. So I'm cautious about generalizing too much about the relationship that you're drawing, but I think that we're not the only discipline within the university that has been centralised and starved of funds, etc. But we have fared much worse than our counterparts in science. I would say that. So what you take from that, I don't know. Has the feminisation changed the department itself? That's also tricky to answer. We are generally, I would say, a much more collegial department now than we were, or you are more collegial, we're more collegial, than we were in some of the years while I've been there. And I think that's been something that has been, we've had to become so. I think that's been a kind of survival thing as well, a strategy, because when you're smaller, you have, getting on with people makes life much easier. It makes it much more enjoyable and pleasurable. And I think we've been successful in cultivating that kind of department. And I think that it wasn't always like that. There wasn't always the commitment to collegiality in the way that I think that there is now. Yeah, amongst, there's always exceptions to that. Yeah, I think there's always been some standout exemplars of collegiality, like Richard, like Rhys, like other people, but there's also been it doesn't take many to create trouble, I suppose. And the bigger you are, the more tensions there inevitably are, interpersonal, intellectual, etc.
Thank you. I think Judy, were you next? Yeah, and then Karen.
I've got a couple of questions, if I may, quickly. One is I'm interested in the physical space that the history department occupies now. Has the department always been in the same corridor, or did it occupy more of the building? Was there always postgraduate students who had their own space there as well? So that's one issue. And the other one is, La Trobe is known to have been a centre of student activism, and I'm wondering if are there any links between such a lively history department and the activist nature of students in the 70s, say?
So I didn't actually go into the culture of the broader culture of the 60s and 70s. I meant to do that, actually, just skipped it. Obviously the late 60s, and Don Watson's quite interesting on this, actually, because he said the very early years in the 67, 68, it was not a very particularly politically radical, but it became very politically radical, along with, some of the other universities in the later 60s and then early 70s. And there's a very famous demonstration that the students at La Trobe held, marching up Wooderdale Road, and, you would know about that, Judy. So the politicization of, or the I think we have always been politically engaged. The extent to which our students have been as politically engaged, I think that has changed. And I think that's happened probably across the university sector. Richard might want to jump in there about that if I'm interpreting your question correctly. The other point about the physical department is that, yes, we used to fill at least the third and first floor, Not sure about the second, because my memories of second was a bit of a mishmash, and that maybe there were some postgrads on the second. There were some teaching rooms on the second floor where we used to teach as well. But certainly it was all of the third and all of the first floor. Postgrads didn't have this kind of facilities that you have now, actually. Richard, do you want to jump in there?
Yeah, look, I think that's probably true. Yeah, because it was such a big department. We virtually had the 3 floors of our half of the David Myers building, but there were, I think, the university staff association had 1 room and whatever, but mostly it was all history. But in terms of the radicalism of it, there were certainly a couple of, and it came from the students even more than the staff. There was a couple of students, Barry York and Fergus Robinson, who were very involved in student protests, and in fact, they had a court order slapped on them that they couldn't enter the administration building anymore, and they defied that, and they were locked up in Pentridge. And while they were in Pentridge, they started a prisoners' action group. So they took their activism into Pentridge and changed the culture in Pentridge about prisoners' rights. And those two actually published a book together called the Black Resistance, which was a set of documents. It was about 100 pages, 120 pages, set of documents on the Aboriginal resistance on the frontier, which was quite amazing for 2 undergraduate students. So the radicalism came from them as much as anywhere. But look, staff in their own ways, like David Potts had radical ideas about teaching. And so at one stage in one of the rooms on the second floor, he brought in paint and he got his students to paint the Depression on one of the big long walls. And the head of the department at the time, I think, got really annoyed about that, and as did the university. But David thought, well, this was a viable way of getting students to think about the Depression, to paint it. So there were a lot of people experimenting with ways of teaching and whatever.
Just on the Barry York and Fergus Robinson, amusingly, at the year of the 50th anniversary of the university in 2017, the university celebrated these students who had been so shunned and almost effectively, they weren't excommunicated from the university, but they were certainly, as Richard says, their access was restricted. So, from the archives, they resurrected these students, and they became kind of a feature of the Trobe's 50th celebrations and publicity around the history of the university. So
and they both went on to do history postgraduate work. Barry York did a PhD, and Fergus Robinson did a master's under me on the Snowy Mountains scheme, looking at the health and safety aspects of the Snowy Mountains scheme. So he brought his radicalism into what he did in terms.
There was a third one as well. I think there's
Brian Poehler.
Yeah, that's right.
But,
yeah,
I don't know whether he went on with history. I don't think so.
Yeah, but he was certainly one of the 3 at the time.
Yeah.
Thank you. Karen, you have a question. Thank you for waiting patiently.
Yes, thank you. That was just so fabulous, Katie. It just so much I had no idea about in what you said. And really moving to just understand how much the history department has been under siege and sustained those series of redundancies and those losses of beloved lecturers and friends in the 2016-2017 period. So really, yeah, it's really lovely to hear that perspective. I was actually going to ask about the physical configuration of the history department, because I know when I came in 2013, it was just so wonderful to have that exchange between the postgrad students and the staff, and to have that happening within the same corridor was just, to me, made such a difference to my experience of being a postgrad student. But I also was really curious, because I know you've said a few times, Katie, when I've been popping in and seeing you trying to clear out your office, that in a way your library is like an archive of the various changes in the subjects that have been taught. And I wondered whether you felt like reflecting a little bit on how, as you're going through that library and that archive, how you reflect on the changes personally in what you've taught and how that has shifted in the time you've been there.
Thanks, Karen. So I was, as I said, I was appointed to teach women's studies. So there's a whole section of my bookshelf that is feminist theory, and books devoted to issues around gender and sexuality, debates within contemporary feminist thought, representation. So for many years I taught the two first-year subjects. Actually devised the two first-year subjects, one of which was called Sex, Gender and Identity, and then the second was Sex, Gender and Diversity. I taught a history subject, took over from Marilyn, a history subject called Gender Relations in Australia, which was a 2-3 subject, and then another subject on contemporary issues in gender relations, which was, not historic, so there was the sort of GRA was history based, and the contemporary issues one was obviously women's studies based. So yeah, there's a part of my bookshelf that absolutely represents that part of my historical or part of my teaching career. And then there's I also was teaching a subject called, which was originally called Gender and War, that I developed, and then it slowly changed its name under the encouragement of students, actually, to Gender at War, not gender, Australians at War, gendered perspectives, and then just Australians at War. Because the students, who were predominantly women in the beginning, they wanted to get more men doing the subject because they felt it was really important that men be getting this perspective on war in Australian history. So the changing name actually was coming from the students. So there's a whole shelf around, Australian war history and gender and war, so, more broadly, and, drawing very much on American and British historians. And then there was the introduction of environmental history, and so that's a whole kind of another shelf in my office of actually first came gardens, and that was where my own research was leading. And then Sue Martin and I taught an honours subject called The Culture of Gardens, which was a combined English history subject, literature subject and history. So we taught that for just 1 year, about 2005. And I found Rhys Isaac. Rhys came and gave a seminar in that department. I found that an email from him anticipating him coming and what he might talk about. And then there's the environmental history work that, as I said, that sort of my interest in environmental history grew out of that work I was doing on gardens. And then so Richard and myself and Charles Fay, and then Ruth Ford joined us, I think, and we developed a reading group. We decided we wanted to teach something on environmental history, so we started a reading group, actually, initially with staff and some postgrads, because we thought we better bring ourselves up to speed in some environmental history. So from that, Richard and I then developed the first environmental history subject that I was talking about. So that's all there in my literally my library, and it's been very interesting for me to see those different strands. And then there's the whole Australian section, which is a mixture of everything, really. So actually at one point I was teaching the migration subject, And when Richard left, he passed on a whole lot of his books that dealt with migration. So they're all there as well. Richard, I think I'll be passing them on to whoever else next wants them. It's actually it's a really interesting way to think about, to see the way in which your career changes and takes you in directions that you didn't anticipate necessarily, but also then to see for me, the cross-section between teaching teaching feminist theory, teaching gender studies as it became, or gender and diversity studies as it became, really fed very much into my other historical work. And in fact, I was, in terms of my employment at the very beginning, while I was doing my PhD at Melbourne, I was very lucky to be asked to, with Lucy Healy, who is an anthropologist, to fill in for Maila Stuyvesant, who was then Director of Women's Studies and was going on sabbatical for a year. And so Lucy and I were asked to basically job share her position for a year. So I was still doing my PhD, but that kind of really forced me into looking much more seriously at feminist theory. It fed into my own work, but it then meant when I came to be looking for employment post-PhD, I both taught history at at Melbourne, and I taught gender studies or women's studies. And so I could spruik myself as somebody who could teach both those in both those areas. So it just doubled the number of jobs I could apply for, basically. This was still at a time when I didn't even know I wanted to be an academic. But anyway, I was going for jobs in both women's studies and in history. And I got a position at the ANU, and then the position at the Trobe was advertised, and I applied for that and was appointed. So then that's how I came to be here. And all those course guides and notes are what I've been going through very slowly and thinking I really need to throw them out, but they're also quite interesting in and of themselves. I've decided I'm very professionally ill-equipped to be a discarder of historical material.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Katie, for that really wonderful presentation. And as Claire said, you put a lot of work into it, and we really appreciate that. And I think it's been a really stimulating and important session. I was just struck overall by how the department was really ahead of its time in a number of areas that now are very fashionable, but at the time weren't. You mentioned the focus on interdisciplinary study from the beginning of the university. I mean, that's now, very much encouraged, but was unusual at the time. The public engagement, again, that was not that fashionable at the time, but now is. And I think, and we've continued that tradition as well. Community engagement as well. And the focus on Aboriginal history and marginalised histories in general, I think that's really been a theme through the whole department. And a lot of the theses we have being produced now, or recent completions, have been on those histories, so that history continues, which I think is really wonderful. So thank you for connecting us more to that and encouraging us to keep going, which is really important. So, and thanks for everyone for attending.
Thank you, Tim. It's been good to actually go through it and to, there's things I hadn't known about that I've discovered, and that's always a good experience. And it's nice to be able to bring it together, and also particularly at this time in my life and career. Sorry, my dog is demanding some attention on the side here.
Pull some of this together.
Thank you for being an interested audience. It's good.
Well, thanks everyone. Have a great day.
Okay.
Bye.
See you.
Bye. Thank you.